Today, we're going to explore a historic case that changed the course of criminal investigations forever. This was the first ever case solved by DNA fingerprinting. This groundbreaking technique was used to catch Colin Pitchfork, a man responsible for the brutal murders of two young girls, Lynda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, in the 1980s. What started as a complex investigation with dead end after dead end took a revolutionary turn when DNA evidence exposed the killer in a way that had never been done before. Instead of being scared of this new technology, the investigators here decided to take a chance and see where it would take them. So, let's dive into the case that pioneered forensic DNA testing and brought justice to these victims and so many victims after them. Our story this week takes us to Leicestershire here in England, focusing in on a series of 3 villages. There's Narborough, Enderby and Littlethorpe. Although these are technically 3 different villages, if you look at them on a map, they kind of look like one. They're all directly next to each other, just interconnected by a series of roads and pathways. The people in these villages all knew each other, the kids went to the same schools, they shopped in the same places, and the people at the time in the 80s said there was a real community spirit. Everyone was very willing to help out a neighbour, you'd stop and chat to people on the street. And in fact, it was such a lovely place, as far back as modern records went, there had never been a murder in these villages. It wasn't even a possibility that crossed people's minds. This was a really, really safe place. Lynda Rosemary Mann was 15 years old and she attended the local Lutterworth Grammar School. She was said to be a bright and well-liked girl, she had plenty of friends and never caused any problems for her parents. She always let them know where she was, she let them know when she was going to be home, she kept them in the loop. So when she got home from school that Monday, they knew that she had a babysitting job nearby. Lynda was a trustworthy kid, she had plenty of families who she babysat for locally. The sources here are a little bit contradictory as to what exactly Lynda's movements were that evening. Some say that she had a second babysitting job lined up that got cancelled, and so when that happened, she decided to go visit a friend. Other sources say that she wasn't babysitting at all, that she was just going to visit friends' houses. I've just realised I don't think I ever mentioned the date here. It was the 21st November 1983. On her way home that evening, Lynda decided to take a shortcut. Now, like I said, she was generally a sensible kid. When it was dark, she usually stayed on the main roads, but it was definitely a longer route. So on the night in question, she decided to take a path that she knew really well. It was a little lane that the locals called the Black Pad. It was basically an alleyway connecting the 2 villages of Narborough and Enderby. It had fencing down one side and just nature like bushes, trees on the other. And it was unlit. During the day, this path was used constantly by the locals, but in the evening, people didn't really tend to use it because it was dark. You couldn't really see in front of you. It was a bit creepy. But it was November, I'm sure in Lynda's head it was cold, she just wanted to get home, so surely she could quickly pop down there this evening. Nothing bad would happen to her in Narborough. But somebody else had a different idea. Lynda never made it out the other side of this alleyway. When her parents returned home later that evening to no sign of their daughter, they immediately panicked and went out searching for her. They got the neighbours to join in and then they soon reported it to the police. And the police did take it seriously quite quickly, but it wasn't a very long search because just the next morning, the parents opened the front door to 2 officers on their doorstep. Lynda had been found and it was bad news. Her body was found down the side of the Black Pad footpath and she had been attacked, raped and strangled with her own scarf. Her clothes were found in disarray. And from the get-go, the officers knew that this was going to be a difficult case. The timing and the area in which Lynda was attacked meant there were no witnesses. And forensic science in 1983 was not what it is now. The only forensic evidence they had at the scene was a semen sample, which when tested revealed that the man they were looking for had type A blood and a specific enzyme profile of PGM. Which does sound like it would be very handy in finding the suspect or at least narrowing it down, but 40% of men have type A blood, and when you look at that in combination with this enzyme, it does narrow it down a bit, but this combination is actually found in 10% of males, so that's 1 in 10. So whilst this could certainly help narrow down a suspect pool, it's not going to help you pinpoint the killer. A man called Detective Superintendent David Baker was the one leading the hunt for Lynda's killer, and the only thing that he could tell for certain was that this was somebody who seemed to know this area well. The Black Pad was a shortcut that would only really be known by locals, and if you were a visitor to Narborough, you wouldn't exactly know this as an area to lie in wait for an unsuspecting victim. So from very early on here, they were focusing in on the local people. And that terrified the entire community. What once felt like a safe and secure place, somewhere where parents could let their kids roam free, within reason of course, was now destroyed. And terrifyingly, another thing that investigators were pretty certain about was that this was not going to be a lone event. It was very clear that the perpetrator here was motivated by sexual fantasy, by sexual desire. And that kind of crime doesn't just happen once. In most similar cases, once the criminal has got a taste and they've not been caught, it's only a matter of time before they strike again, before that desire for that sexual fulfillment builds up once more. Criminal psychologist Paul Britton, whose name you might actually recognise from my episode on Rachel Nickel, theorised that the killer was likely somebody local, but also somebody in a stable relationship, probably a man with a wife and children. He would be unsuspecting, normal, a family man who went to work every day. But this kind of fit a lot of people in Narborough and the surrounding areas. This profile really didn't help narrow anything down. The team working on Lynda's case slowly whittled down to just a few people. They just looked over the evidence when it came in. And the years passed and there was nothing. Slowly, Narborough and the surrounding villages went back to normal. Lynda wasn't forgotten about, her case was left open, but there was just nothing more they could do with her without any more evidence. And then we fast forward 3 years to the 31st of July 1986. 15-year-old Dawn Ashworth lived in Enderby and, just like Lynda, attended Lutterworth Grammar School. She was described as bright and happy, sensible, again really similar to Lynda. And she also resembled Lynda quite closely too. They both had this dark hair and quite similar features. That evening, Dawn had been to visit a friend and was on her way home from said visit. Her friend lived in Narborough and she lived in Enderby and decided to take a shortcut after crossing over the dual carriageway, down a footpath known as £10 Lane. Now again, this was a path that Dawn had taken countless times. It was well walked by locals. But again, it was the kind of place that somebody would only know about if they were local. Your standard person just passing through this area wouldn't have any idea that it existed. 2 days later, Dawn's body would be found hidden in the undergrowth near the lane. Just like Lynda, Dawn had been sexually assaulted and strangled, her clothes being found in the same kind of disarray. And almost immediately, investigators made the connections between the two cases. The similarities were undeniable here, and they happened in neighbouring villages. It was assumed from day one here that both girls had been victims of the same killer, and this just further cemented the fact that this must have been a local person. Initial forensic testing in Dawn's case did reveal some clues. Once again, just like Lynda, semen samples were recovered from the body, and testing showed that the attacker had not only the same blood type as the perpetrator in Lynda's case, but also the same enzyme profile. And whilst this was very interesting information to know, these tests weren't specific enough to pinpoint an individual suspect. Like I said, 10% of men have the same blood type and enzyme profile. So it was very good to rule suspects out, but it wasn't enough to point the finger at anyone. And they couldn't even confirm with this information that it was the same person. They could say it probably was, but like I said, it was 10% of people, 10% of men. However, unlike Lynda's case, which happened in the dark at night time, Dawn was killed in daylight, right near a very busy dual carriageway, and that meant there was more chance of a witness. Whilst no one saw the attack itself, one woman who was driving past would later report seeing a man hanging around the path at the time that Dawn was attacked. Other witnesses reported seeing a motorcycle parked under a nearby bridge, and recently a man had been hanging around this area a lot, a man known to ride a motorcycle. Now, this man made himself known to police and to the investigation pretty quickly. It was a 17-year-old man slash boy called Richard Buckland. He apparently went round Narborough telling people that the police were looking in the wrong area. He even approached the police and told them that. He just made himself very known, he got very involved in the investigation, and we all know there are many cases where the perpetrator likes to make themselves known. They get some kind of thrill from being close to everything under the guise of being a helpful local citizen. So yeah, Buckland was hanging around, he was being a bit suspicious, and eventually the police interviewed him. He wasn't able to provide an account of where he was on the night of Dawn's murder, and he just so happened to match the blood type and enzyme profile. So very quickly, Richard Buckland was arrested and charged with the murder of Dawn Ashworth. And not only that, he confessed. Everyone in the local area was relieved. Finally, the perpetrator was off the streets. Teenage girls were safe to roam once more. But of course, there were a few issues. Whilst Buckland admitted to Dawn's murder, he point blank refused to admit to Lynda's. And as I said, he was 17 years old. That would have made him just 14 when he would have murdered Lynda. Was this kind of depravity really the work of a teenage boy, a 14-year-old teenage boy at that? But the crimes were so similar, they had to be linked. He confessed to Dawn's, so he had to be guilty of Lynda's as well. Something that seems to be pretty brushed over in a lot of the reports about this case is that Richard Buckland also had pretty severe learning disabilities. He would later say that yes, he did confess to Dawn's murder, but he was coerced into doing so. And I don't doubt that when he says it. We've covered countless cases where an innocent person is pressured by the police into confessing to a crime that they didn't commit, where sneaky interview techniques are used to convince even the most switched on people into making a confession. This was the 1980s after all. These kind of interview techniques would have been much more accepted, shall we say, in this time. Buckland said that he was told things like they can't help him unless he confesses, that just admitting it is going to make his time in prison so much easier because he's going to go there anyway, they've got evidence, etc, etc. And a lot of people get pulled in by these techniques, but especially a more vulnerable person like Buckland. So yeah, he admitted to Dawn's murder, but the police were getting increasingly frustrated by his lack of admission to Lynda's. They knew this had to be the same person. And that's when a man called Alec Jeffreys, working at the local University of Leicester, comes into the picture. He's a geneticist who a couple of years beforehand, in September 1984, came up with the idea of DNA fingerprinting. He says that he was looking at X-ray film images of a DNA experiment he'd done on the DNA of his technician's family, and the images showed him the similarities and the differences between the DNA of different family members, how 50% comes from the mum, 50% comes from the dad, how siblings pick up like similar but different DNA, and apparently within just half an hour of looking at all of this, he came up with the idea of DNA fingerprinting, which uses variations in genetic information to identify individuals. Just imagine having a brain that can think like that, because I cannot relate. DNA fingerprinting is also known as DNA profiling or forensic genetics. And we're about to get real sciencey here, so I hope you're ready. DNA is found in every cell inside your body, being a chain of chemical compounds that join together to form you, to form anything. These compounds are called bases, and there are 4 of them, pairing up with another to form what are called base pairs, and your DNA has about 3 billion of these couples. The complete set of compounds is called a genome, and more than 99.9% of everyone's genome is identical, like that's what makes you human. But that tiny 0.1% is what sets you apart from everyone else, that's what makes you different. And 0.1% of 3 billion is still quite a lot. The technique that Alec Jeffreys came up with used chemicals to separate these strands of DNA to reveal the unique parts of your genome, to reveal that 0.1%. And it shows up in a pattern of stripes, kind of like a barcode. And every single person has a different barcode, like no 2 peoples are the same, apart from identical twins, but let's not get into that. Which, as you can imagine, as we all know, has wild repercussions in the world of crime. Jeffrey realised just how possible it was to compare the barcode of DNA found at crime scenes to that of suspects. So this was all realised in 1984, and over the next year, Jeffries improved his process. He developed a variation called genetic profiling, and he was receiving a lot of publicity for all of this. It was first put to use in 1985 when he was asked to help in an immigration case to confirm the identity of a British boy whose family was originally from Ghana. And it was realised how useful it could be in paternity cases. And then in 1987, the investigators in Dawn and Lynda's case, frustrated with Buckland's lack of confession, decided to take a chance. This was brand new technology, and there were two things that law enforcement could do at this point. Either they could run from it and be scared of it, or they could embrace it. And no one had embraced it yet. I don't even know if it had crossed anyone's minds for use in criminal cases. But the investigators here decided to do it. They contacted Jeffries, and at this point in time, his lab was the only place in the entire world where this kind of testing could happen. And it just so happened to be just down the road at the University of Leicester. In doing this, the investigators just wanted to prove that Richard not only killed Dawn, but also killed Lynda. Like, they thought they had their man. And so Jeffries extracted DNA from all of the samples, the semen from both scenes and Buckland's DNA. And shock horror, when the results came back, it was confirmed that Buckland could not have been the person responsible for Dawn's murder. The DNA barcode was completely different. So yeah, that kind of sucked for the police, but Jeffries was able to confirm the police's suspicion all along that the same person was definitely 100% responsible for both murders. So I suppose in a way the first criminal use of DNA fingerprinting wasn't even necessarily to capture a killer, but perhaps to eliminate one. On the 21st November 1986, Richard Buckland was released and the entire investigation was back to square one. Sure, they had confirmation they were looking for just one perpetrator, but that one perpetrator was nowhere on their radar. This whole thing was actually quite embarrassing for the police. They needed to do something big in order to catch him, and most importantly, to ensure that the killer didn't strike again. All of the psychoanalysis of this guy suggested that it was only a matter of time, that each assault, each murder satiated him for just a little bit before he kind of wound up again, ready to explode. They knew that if they didn't catch him, there was going to be another dead girl. So Detective Superintendent Baker decided to do something pretty unprecedented. He took what could have been a very controversial step and decided to blood test all of the men in the villages of Narborough, Littlethorpe and Enderby, all of the men that were between the ages of 17 and 35. All the profiling pointed towards the perpetrator being in this age range, as well as being likely married, domesticated, with kids. Now, it is important to note that this blood testing was entirely voluntary. There was nothing forcing the men to turn up and get tested. They weren't going to get arrested. And of course, the police didn't expect for a second that the killer would actually willingly turn up to get tested. They didn't think that this was going to be how they caught the killer. But this was going to be a fantastic way to eliminate people, to narrow down the suspect pool to just a few people, and then that makes the police's job so much easier. The idea also relied on peer pressure, on community spirit, and I can imagine at this time this was a pretty scary technology, that people perhaps wouldn't have fully understood it and its applications, but as I've already mentioned, these villages were super close-knit. There was this huge idea of just wanting to keep people safe, of having each other's backs. So when this blood testing program was first announced, the majority of men were more than willing to donate. I mean, they had nothing to lose, right? They hadn't killed them, and it would just help the police find the killer. And it is also worth mentioning that there was no DNA database at this time, so whilst I can imagine that that would be a worry nowadays, people would worry about their data being stored and kept on some database somewhere, it didn't really cross people's minds at this time in 1987. There wasn't the idea of the government having their DNA. They just wanted to help catch a killer, and people really showed up. All in all, they took the blood of over 6,000 men. First up, they would test the blood type and the enzyme profile, and if that was a match, which 10% would have been, the blood would then progress onto the DNA fingerprinting. And of course, no one was ever a match. This was just a process of elimination. And the investigators were not stupid here, they weren't blind to the fact that the killer would likely get somebody else to take the blood test for them eventually, but they had to give this a go. Because if the killer did get somebody else to do this test test for them, it's not like they would tell the other person the reason they were doing this. It wouldn't be like, oh yeah, I need you to give the blood for me because I was actually the killer. No, they'd likely come up with some sort of excuse, and eventually that person would let slip to somebody else who would hopefully contact the authorities. Egos are a really interesting thing. It's rare that somebody will do something nice, something so big for somebody else, and just keep quiet about it forever, especially when they don't know the full stakes of it. So this was a waiting game, and in the end, that is exactly what happened. Unbeknownst to the police at the time, the man they were looking for was called Colin Pitchfork. He was born in March 1940, which would have made him 23 and 27 at the time of both murders, exactly within that 17 to 35 age bracket the experts put forward. He was also married, he had kids, had a solid job, and lived locally in Littlethorpe. At the time of Lynda's murder, he didn't actually live in the villages, but he had been looking at houses in the area. And by the time of Dawn's, him and his wife had moved to Littlethorpe. He worked at a place called Hampshire's Bakery in Leicester, where he was an expert baker. He was very adept at icing and decorating cakes, and he was, for the most part, a very good worker. He always turned up on time, but he was known to have mood swings and was generally creepy towards his female colleagues. He was constantly trying to chat them up, he was flirting, he wouldn't leave them alone, despite the fact that everyone knew that he was married. But hey, he was just a ladies' man, just a flirt, it was harmless. I doubt the woman thought that, but his employers apparently did. Harmless. But Colin Pitchfork had a bit of a dark past. In October 1977, at the age of 17, he was fined for exposing himself to a schoolgirl. In 1979, he forced a 16-year-old girl into a field and sexually assaulted her. In February 1980, he exposed himself to 2 teenage girls and was given a year's probation. So yeah, the signs were definitely there that he perhaps had some perverted sexual desires, that he enjoyed making teenage girls uncomfortable, and often things like this do tend to escalate. Investigators did look for people with criminal history in the area, particularly looking for sex crimes. However, this was the 1980s, so there was no sort of online database to quickly search through. This had to be a manual search, looking through each and every physical file. And honestly, I don't know if Pitchfork came up in this because his crimes didn't happen in the immediate local area. He was born and raised in Leicestershire, but he was from an area about 25 minutes away. And I did try and search to see if his name came up in this, if his past came up. I couldn't really find an answer. I know they looked for people with past criminal histories. I don't know if they found him. What I do know though is that very early on, police officers did speak to him. In their early investigation into Lynda's murder, they conducted door-to-door interviews with all men fitting the general description. His wife answered the door whilst Pitchfork was upstairs, and when he came down, he seemed very calm and unflustered. There was nothing in the interview that raised any red flags, and when asked what he was doing on the night of Lynda's murder, he did have somewhat of an alibi that his wife actually confirmed. Every Monday evening, he would drop his wife off at an exercise class, and then he'd spend the evening looking after their children. And surely no one would commit murder in the presence of their kids. The police officers saw no red flags and they just moved on. But little did they know that Colin Pitchfork did commit murder in the presence of his infant child that night. On his way back from dropping off his wife, he happened to drive past Lynda on his walk home. He watched as she entered the lane, he parked up his car, leaving his baby in the back seat, and he followed her. At first he exposed himself and then he grabbed her, whilst his kid was just sat in the back of the car. So now some years have passed, it's 1987, there's this massive blood campaign, and Pitchfork knew that the walls were eventually going to close in on him. As I said, this was a massive community effort, and the people who were refusing to give blood were being very much looked down upon. There was definitely a judgment there. Pitchfork told people that the reason he didn't want to give his blood was because of his history as a flasher, that he knew the police would try and frame him for something, they'd zone in on him because he was a sexual criminal. But the pressure got more and more until eventually he did exactly what the police thought the killer would do, that he would convince somebody else to give blood under his name. In doing this, Pitchfork had to make sure that he chose the right sort of person. Somebody gullible, somebody who didn't think too deeply about things, but also somebody who was always willing to help others out, somebody kind. And he chose one of his work colleagues, a man called Ian. He was going to be his unsuspecting accomplice in getting away with murder. Pitchfork spun this tale about how he couldn't give his blood because he'd already helped out a friend by posing as him. He told Ian that this friend had a history of flashing and that his friend was scared, so he helped him out, but now he's backed himself into a corner because he can't give his own blood because they'd realised that he'd given double blood. And he didn't want to get into trouble, he said. He said Ian would be doing a massive favour by helping him out. And Ian himself didn't live in any of the 3 villages, so he wasn't expected to give blood himself. At first, Ian refused. He didn't want to get caught, he was scared of the repercussions, but for 6 whole weeks, Pitchfork went on and on and on until eventually Ian conceded. Sure, he'll help him out. So how did they pull this off when each man going in needed to show ID? Well, Pitchfork got Ian to go and take a new passport photo at the photo booth, and then using all of the skills that he picked up in years of cake decorating, a very steady hand and ability to create these very intricate designs, he was able to manipulate his passport. Back in the 80s, the photo wasn't embedded, like printed onto the passport page like it is now. Instead, the actual photo booth photo would essentially be laminated onto the page with a plastic film over the top. So Colin carefully peeled away the plastic film, which would have been a very tricky job, but he did it, and replaced the photo before putting the film perfectly back in place. Just taking a cursory look at this page, you wouldn't have thought there was anything wrong with it. And then he sent Ian off to the police station with the passport and the letter calling him for the test, whilst he just waited outside in the car. Soon, Colin Pitchfork had a letter confirming that he was not a match, and he was good to continue about his normal life. This is a letter that he could show his wife, show people who asked, a letter that enabled him to stop feeling like an outcast. It stopped him having all of the attention on him, and it did work for a while. But just as police suspected, Ian didn't stay quiet for long. Ian said it would bother him when Colin went around work telling people that he'd done the blood test and it had come back as negative, because he hadn't. And then one day, a group of colleagues from the bakery were at the pub, and Colin wasn't there, but he came up in conversation. And he wasn't exactly the most well-liked person in the world. There was one woman there in particular who really didn't like him, thanks to his very creepy ways. And one of the men brought up how Colin had asked him to do the blood test for him. And that's when Ian piped up, telling the table that, oh, he'd done that for him instead. The woman in the group, who already really didn't like Colin Pitchfork, immediately saw the red flags in this, and she went home thinking about it. Over the next few days, she sat on the information, but she couldn't quite shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right here, and eventually she called the police. She thought she was just being silly, she thought she was being overcautious, but this perfectly encapsulates what I say all the time. You never know what tiny piece of information you might know that could be the thing that completes the puzzle, that could provide all the answers. This woman thought she was being silly worrying about this so much, but she solved 2 murder cases and saved God knows how many more lives. This was the exact kind of tidbit the police had been waiting for. They knew that eventually this would come out, and straight away they looked at the records for the day that Pitchfork gave blood, and they compared the signature on the paperwork to his real signature and found that it was not a match, and with that they had grounds to arrest him. On the 18th September 1987, officers sat outside Colin Pitchfork's house and waited for him to come home, and when they did, they descended, arresting him immediately. His wife was with him and she was baffled as to what was going on. She was upset and confused and shouting at her husband, asking what was happening. And he told her that he was being arrested for the murders of them girls. When she asked if he'd done it, he just said yes. He didn't even try and deny it. He knew the jig was up. And sure enough, the police retested his blood and confirmed once and for all that his DNA was matched to the forensic evidence. This was pretty much all they needed, but he did also give them a full confession as well, not only to these murders but also to 2 other sexual assaults. When asked why he targeted Dawn, Pitchfork's only response was opportunity. She was there and I was there. There was no feeling, no upset. He killed two 15-year-old girls because they were there, because he deemed his sexual desire more important than their right to life. He later said that the only reason he even killed the girls was because they'd be able to identify him. Like, it was the sexual element he wanted here. The murder was just inconsequential. And that's even more frustrating in a way. Like, their lives meant so little. He just wanted to rape them and get away with it. That's why he killed them, not because he got something from the actual murder. It was later found in psychiatric testing that Pitchfork had a personality disorder of psychopathic type, accompanied by serious psychosexual pathology. Psychopathy is embodied by impaired empathy and remorse, compared with boldness, disinhibition, and egocentrism. A true psychopath will have a lack of guilt and a lack of fear, but often learns how to disguise these traits in daily life in order to fit in with society to go undetected. Not all people with psychopathy will go on to become violent criminals, of course, but Colin Pitchfork certainly did. An expert warned at sentencing that Pitchfork will obviously continue to be an extremely dangerous individual whilst the psychopathology continues, and psychopathy isn't something that necessarily changes. I mean, a person can learn to deal with their psychopathy, but it's not something that can necessarily ever be fixed, be cured. And I would argue that a person like Pitchfork perhaps would never be changed. Once you've already murdered two teenage girls in cold blood, you're probably already too far gone. In January 1988, Pitchfork appeared at Leicester Crown Court, where he pled guilty to 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of rape, 2 of indecent assault, and 1 count of conspiring to pervert the course of justice. Due to his guilty plea, his confession, there was no need for a full trial, and this did mean that the DNA evidence wasn't ever fully examined in court, and it would have been really interesting to see how the prosecution and defence would have dealt with that in these brand new waters, but it wasn't needed. On the back of his guilty plea, Pitchfork was sentenced to life imprisonment, and in accordance with the practice at the time, the minimum term was set at 30 years. He was only 27 years old, meaning he could be 57 when he got released. At the time, there were sighs of relief that this man was now locked up, that he could no longer harm anyone else. But there has been controversy over the past few years as his minimum term of 30 years came around. In April 2016, the Parole Board heard his case for early release on parole, with advocates saying how he had improved his character, he got a degree, he focused on his education. He apparently became an expert at transcribing printed music into Braille, which, sure, good for him. He still killed 2 teenage girls and never once expressed remorse. Lynda and Dawn's families obviously hugely opposed this, and it was soon announced that his release had been refused, but he was instead moved to an open prison, a prison in which there are no cells in which inmates are locked. They just live freely within the grounds with minimal supervision. They might even be allowed to take up employment in the local area and actually gradually reintegrate into society. In 2017, there were reports of Pitchfork being seen wandering around Bristol, so it certainly seemed like they were working towards a full release for him. I mean, open prisons are often, not always, but often, used as a stopgap between proper prison and release. However, in 2018, his release was refused once again. In 2021, however, 33 years after he was imprisoned, Pitchfork was granted release on conditional licence. He was released on the 1st September and by November was recalled back to prison because he was breaching his licence conditions by approaching young women. Yep, who's shocked? Not me. His parole officer apparently watched as he approached a lone female in a car park directly outside of his parole office, which was in direct breach of his licence conditions. He was not allowed to approach young women. Now, there's not anything inherently awful in this, but why can't he just stop himself? Many people close to this case believe that his psychopathy is just so that he would be able to convince people on the inside that he had been reformed, that he would be able to keep up this charade until he got his release. It was announced in June 2023 that yes, he would be released under parole once again, saying that the decision to recall Pitchfork to prison was flawed and his detention is no longer necessary for public safety. As you can imagine, once again, there was public outrage. He'd already proven once that he couldn't be trusted. He was a double murderer, a rapist. And in response to this, the Lord Chancellor got involved and asked the board to reconsider. and they did. In December 2023 though, parole was denied. The board said this was due to a lack of information about Pitchfork's current attitudes towards sex and protracted and inconsistent explanations from the killer as to why he was recalled to prison. Which brings us to this year, 2024, and this whole thing is still ongoing. The last public information I could find comes from the Daily Mail, sorry, it was all I could find, from about 2 weeks ago. Apparently he was supposed to have hearings in October and November, but they've been adjourned because Pitchfork was launching a legal bid for a judicial review. It's not entirely clear what's going on here. Apparently there was new information submitted to the panel relating to risk. There were new allegations of conduct, bad conduct, I think. He's fighting all this. It's all a bit of a mess, but at least for the moment, he does remain behind bars. For how much longer? Who knows? Listen, I'm all up for reform and rehabilitation. I do believe that the goal of prison should be rehabilitation. The goal should be to release people back out to become productive members of society. But I also believe that within reason, crime dependent, background dependent. I do not believe that somebody who murdered two 15-year-old girls in cold blood just because he wanted to get his rocks off, should be allowed to walk the streets again. This wasn't an accident. He raped them and then murdered them so they couldn't tell. And in my mind, that makes it even worse. Like, you didn't even get your thrill from murdering them. That wasn't your goal. That was just inconsequential. And that makes me so angry. It just blows my mind. And this man should not be released. You murder two people, you spend life in prison. Like, that is the trade-off here. Lynda and Dawn and their families don't get the option of being free. So why should you? They were 15 years old. They had their entire lives ahead of them, and he took it away because he wanted to. Because he got a sexual thrill out of it. What? So there you go, that is the first case that was ever solved using DNA fingerprint, a technique that is now the standard across the world. It didn't take long after this for Jeffries to become the centre of attention of investigators worldwide, trying to solve their own cases, and his lab was obviously inundated with testing requests. The Home Office immediately took steps to get technicians and forensic scientists trained in this, so this could be something that was routinely incorporated in police work across the UK and then across the world. Of course, there were some things to iron out first, like ethics and legislation, etc., but all the case updates I talk about nowadays, those being identified, old evidence being retested and providing fresh answers leading to arrests. It's even led to miscarriages of justice being overturned, innocent people being finally freed. He's now a professor of genetics at the University of Leicester, and in 1994 he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth for his service to genetics, making him Professor Sir Alec Jeffries. What a truly incredible legacy that is to leave on the world. Like, he changed the entire face of forensic science, of police investigation, just on a random morning. That is wild. I'm so glad that I learnt this story. Just a few weeks ago I was researching for another video and it just occurred to me, I was like, what is the first case that was ever solved using DNA? So I gave it a Google and that's how I learned about this, and I just had to share the story with all of you because in the future when we're talking about cases being solved using DNA, we get to remember Dawn and Lynda. Like, I do think, as well as being an amazing legacy for Professor Jeffries, it's also an amazing legacy for Dawn and Lynda. Like, their names are going to be linked to every single case that is ever solved using DNA technology, and that is incredible. I'm pretty sure the families would still rather they were alive though, and that Colin Pitchfork stays in prison, where he belongs. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.